In the midst of a snow-white field, a blue-haired man lay collapsed in a pool of blood with his sword snapped in two beside him, while his elf disciple named Letitia stood looking at her master with tear-blurred eyes and softly called, "Master." At that moment, the man smiled in satisfaction to be dying by his disciple's hand and thought that his life hadn't been so bad. Yet inwardly, he felt a twinge of regret, realizing he had lived a life without any luck with women. In his final moments, he silently prayed that if there really were an afterlife, he would surely be surrounded by women. The scene cuts to a magnificent mansion belonging to the Curatus family with the caption, "Main residence of Lady Curatus," revealing a peaceful courtyard with a large central plaza and a neatly trimmed fountain. At that moment, a dry leaf detached from a tall tree and slowly drifted down through the air. Suddenly, a young maid with an orange ponytail appeared and shouted, "Ha!" She struck a heroic, decisive pose with her broom as if it were a legendary sword, her eyes intensely focused on the falling object. The leaf landed lightly on the ground, in front of the maid's shoes without a scratch. Annette stood there bewildered, wondering how she used to cut through anything with a stick yet had failed now, when suddenly a large shadow carrying lethal intent and fury appeared behind her with a gruff call, "Annette." The elderly housekeeper with a stern face immediately delivered a heavy smack to Annette's head, making her clutch her head in pain and grimace. The old woman shouted, demanding to know why Annette dared play war games in the central courtyard. Annette angrily snapped back in a rude tone, asking the old woman what the hell she was doing. The housekeeper didn't hesitate to pinch Annette's cheek painfully and scold her for her coarse speech, reminding her that as a servant of the prestigious Curatus family, she must preserve her master's dignity and ordered her to use more polite language. Though in tears from the pain, Annette reluctantly replied sarcastically, "Yes, yes, I know." Just as the housekeeper turned her back, she suddenly grabbed Annette by the collar and lifted her up effortlessly like a doll. Despite Annette thrashing her limbs in the air and shouting for the stinking old hag to let go, she angrily declared with a flushed face that she was the world's strongest sword saint. The housekeeper carried Annette off while scolding her to stop daydreaming about sword saints and warning her not to speak such frivolous words. Annette dangled helplessly, cursing "damn it," and feeling humiliated that a master like her had fallen into such a ridiculous situation. She sadly looked down at the vast garden from above and silently reaffirmed once more that she really had been a sword saint. Images of her glorious past returned to prove her claim, a valiant warrior known as the Sword Saint, a man who lived for the sword and died for the sword. He had once slain demons and defeated the strongest foes, and was a hero who single-handedly subdued giant dragons by the power of the sword in his hand. In Annette's mind now was the image of her past life. A famed swordmaster named Arnuk Brustrom, wielder of the Overlord sword, and revered as the mightiest sword saint, who ironically fell to illness at 48 and had his life ended by a merciful strike from his own disciple. The current young maid, standing before the mirror, couldn't help but be stunned and told herself that she was indeed her former self. Standing before the large mirror in her private room, Annette stared at her reflection, a petite girl with wide eyes and her hair tied high, and couldn't hide her shock mixed with panic as she wondered who the person in the glass really was, then muttered a rude remark characteristic of her past life upon seeing her new body. Annette began testing her new body by flexing her thin arms, but felt only soft flesh with no muscle. She was thoroughly disappointed as she patted her flat chest and sighed deeply. Although she knew she had wished to be reborn with luck with women, Annette still couldn't accept that she had become such a fragile little girl. Refusing to give up, the little girl stretched and delivered a barehanded slash into the air to test her speed and strength, but the result left her deeply disappointed because the movements were far too slow and weak compared to the instincts of a sword saint. Annette could only stand frozen before the mirror with a sullen face as she realized the harsh truth about her current physique. The maid Annette continued to stare into the mirror with a dejected expression, muttering that she truly couldn't understand why she had to carry this body. But a second later, as she examined the features of her face closely, her expression shifted from surprise to smugness. Annette began making all kinds of faces, from stern to beaming, to admire this new appearance. After a while of admiring herself, Annette suddenly broke into a self-satisfied smile and praised how adorable her new body was, even confidently insisting that if her chest were to develop a bit more, she would surely become a striking beauty. Her face was filled with joy as she discovered a new advantage in this life. With growing confidence, Annette struck a proud hands-on-hips pose before the mirror and fantasized about a future where men would surround and dote on her. She even winked mischievously at the thought of a life full of admirers, But that dream was immediately cut short by the housekeeper's authoritative shout. "Annette!" Startled by the shout, Annette hurriedly pulled on her maid uniform at breakneck speed while muttering that things were getting really bad. She dashed out of the room and called back, "Yes, ma'am, Tilda, I'm coming," to avoid the old woman's wrath. At that moment, in the mansion's long corridor, the housekeeper was already waiting with an extremely stern and cold expression. Maglet, the housekeeper, narrowed her eyes and inspected Annette from head to toe before remarking that it seemed she had no problems and her preparations were fairly good. Hearing that rare praise, Annette breathed a sigh of relief at escaping trouble and silently thanked her luck that she wouldn't have to endure one of Maglet's long-winded lectures. As Maglet led Annette down the corridor, she began to remind her that their Equus family line had long served this household. She emphasized that the mansion's master had been in the royal capital, but would officially return today. So Annette must under no circumstances commit any discourtesy that would tarnish the family's reputation when facing their master. While they walked together, Maglet continued with a stern expression that Annette must pay special attention to Miss Rosarena, who had just recovered after a period of convalescence. She even hinted threateningly that if Annette dared cause the young lady any harm, even a little, she would not let it pass, causing Annette to close her eyes and reply, "Yes, ma'am, I know," in a somewhat weary tone. Because of her flippant attitude and impolite reply, Annette was immediately met with a sharp smack to the head from Maglet, making her clutch the swelling and pain. The old woman loudly demanded where Annette had learned to speak like a man. As she rubbed her head, Annette silently complained that the truth was she was actually a 40-something uncle inside, so changing the way she spoke was impossible. The sound of horses' hooves and creaking wheels from the main gate drew their attention as a luxurious carriage stopped at the mansion, and the master's family disembarked. Maglet urged Annette to pull herself together because the master had truly returned, and then the mansion's great doors swung open with a solemn thud. A gentleman in noble attire and a tall hat appeared on the threshold with his gentle wife in an elegant dress, both wearing radiant smiles. Maglet immediately bowed respectfully and exclaimed, "Welcome home, sir and madam," while Annette stood beside her trying to maintain an appropriate small smile so as not to spoil the formal atmosphere. The master cheerfully returned Maglet's greeting and expressed his gratitude that she had overseen the household affairs in his absence. Maglet modestly replied that it was merely the duty of a member of the Equus line who had long served this house, and then the master suddenly noticed the little maid standing beside them and curiously asked about the identity of this adorable child. Maglet proudly introduced that this was her niece, named Annette. Immediately the girl performed a practiced, polite curtsy in proper maid fashion. Annette announced boldly her full name, Annette Equus, and promised to do her utmost to serve the masters despite her youth, prompting admiration from both the master and mistress. The master laughed with amusement and praised Annette as a bright, well-mannered child, but Maglet hastily corrected the mistress that the girl was actually a very troublesome, unbroken horse, despite her appearance. She added that just the other day Annette had claimed to be the famed sword saint, which made the mistress only smile kindly, thinking it was the harmless mischief of a child. While the housekeeper continued airing the girl's faults to the masters, Annette stood silently with a forced smile and a bead of sweat rolling down her cheek, trying to maintain the appearance of an obedient maid while inwardly feeling embarrassed and humiliated that her cool secrets had become everyone's joke. At that moment, another small figure appeared behind the master, a girl with long flowing hair and sorrow-tinged yet proud eyes, arms crossed as she watched with a distant, cold attitude, forming a stark contrast to the lively commotion between the adults and Annette. Annette was stunned to recognize her as Miss Rosarena, whom Maglet had mentioned, and as Annette fumbled, Rosarena quietly asked, "You, who are you?" Annette hurried to regain her composure and formally greeted again, stating that she would be responsible for caring for and serving the young lady from now on, but Rosarena only responded with a soft sigh and a look full of doubt. Miss Rosarena stepped closer to Annette and murmured, "Hey, you," then suddenly issued an arrogant challenge that if she won, Annette must submit and become her subordinate, leaving the little maid dumbfounded as she blankly replied, "Huh." But immediately Rosarena shouted, "Orea," and launched a fierce, unexpected attack. A powerful straight punch from Rosarena's small hand struck Annette squarely in the face, distorting the maid's features from the force and jerking her head back in excruciating pain, giving her no time to mount any defensive reaction against the girl's astonishing speed. Rosarena's eyes were sharp and resolute after delivering the blow. She was not weak as her sickly appearance suggested, but displayed a highly professional fighting stance, a strong contrast to the image of the maid being knocked away behind her. Annette was hurled high and tumbled down the steps amid Maglet's and the mistress's shock. She lay sprawled with eyes spinning and tongue lolling from dizziness, inwardly thinking that in her past life she had been too strong, which led to her being completely unprepared for such a humiliating defeat. Seeing Annette lying motionless, the master and mistress could only gape in astonishment while Maglet panicked and screamed. Annette began to recall that the extraordinary power of her previous life had made her isolated. And the only disciple she had raised like a daughter once prayed that one day her master would be freed from that loneliness, making Annette realize that perhaps that moment had truly arrived. Rosarena stood over her unconscious opponent with a smug smile and declared that she herself would become the sword saint, while Annette lay on the floor with stars circling her head, muttering, "Ahaha, I can even see stars," beginning a difficult but entertaining journey for the former sword saint to overcome the shadow of her own past. A tragic black and white flashback appeared depicting the famed sword saint Brustrom struck through the chest by a lethal blow as blood spattered in the snowy sky. Beside him, his close disciple stood stunned in agony at witnessing her master fall. This scene also serves as the cover for Chapter 2 titled, Admiring the Overlord's Sword. Standing amid the driving snow, the elf disciple with tear-blurred eyes and a dazed face kept calling, "Master! Master!" She trembled, clutching a broken sword as she faced the harsh truth that her greatest teacher was drawing his last breath at her feet. Though lying in a pool of blood, Sword Saint Brustrom forced a satisfied smile and comforted his disciple that a future sword saint like her should not wear such a mournful expression. But the elf girl choked out that she was unworthy of inheriting that noble title, for she had never once been able to touch or surpass her master's supreme swordsmanship. Brustrom laughed bitterly at his disciple's words and insisted that it was she who had ended his life. He also apologized for forcing her into this painful role, since he could not resist the cruel illness. And hearing that only deepened the elf girl's anguish as she begged her master not to apologize, for she understood better than anyone the heart of someone who would rather die by the blade than succumb to disease. In his final moments, the sword saint looked deep into his disciple's eyes and spoke her name one last time with all his affection. He thought to himself that he was not truly alone because he had a disciple, or rather a girl like her by his side. And at the same time, memories returned of him patting the small elf's head and hoping that one day he would be freed from the loneliness of being the strongest. The thought, "I am not alone, I am fine," echoed through the dark until a faint light appeared. And then Annette jolted awake in the sickbed, eyes wide and breathing fast. Still reeling from the dream of her past life, she found herself lying in an unfamiliar room with a fever patch on her forehead. Seeing Annette move, Lady Curatus, who had been sitting nearby, hurriedly asked with a worried look if she was hurt anywhere. Annette then gradually remembered that she had been knocked unconscious by Miss Rosarena with a single punch. She felt utterly humiliated that someone who had been a sword saint could be so easily defeated. To Annette's surprise, Lady Curatus bowed her head and apologized for her daughter's rough behavior, asking that Annette not hate the young lady because of it, which left Annette stunned and flustered as she waved her hands to stop it, insisting that a noble should not lower herself to apologize to a servant. She affirmed she bore no grudge and urged the lady to keep her proper station. The lady smiled gently and explained that it was not truly an apology but a mother's plea. She confided that Miss Rosarena had never been around children her age, so perhaps the girls simply didn't know how to behave properly. And while the lady spoke sadly, Annette could not help but be surprised by her mistress's compassionate heart. The lady went on to say that Rosarena had endured a long struggle with illness in the National Hospital, and that her only companion then had been books. Hearing that, Annette wondered how a girl who only read books could have trained such a fierce physique and combat skill, which made the lady smile wryly at the young maid's innocence. Annette scratched her head awkwardly as the lady spoke of the young lady's love of reading. She stammered, wondering if they had any shared interests to make conversation easier, and seeing Annette's sincere concern and deep care for her daughter. The lady's eyes suddenly filled with tears of emotion. She choked as she took the little maid's hand and offered heartfelt thanks, leaving Annette to smile wryly and think that she too understood that feeling of loneliness. The lady continued, explaining that Rosarena did not read ordinary books but especially loved adventure tales, heroic legends, and above all the anecdotes about the sword saint. At this, Annette jumped in shock with an incredulous look, and the lady added with a radiant smile that her daughter greatly admired the famed sword saint, leaving Annette frozen for a few seconds in astonishment. A historical info page appeared explaining the kingdom of Saint Gresha, where 4 great knightly houses known as the 4 Great Knight Dukes existed. Among them, the Lady Curatus family was one, and had produced many sword saints in the past. However, the story also revealed the painful truth that for many recent generations, this family had not produced a single new sword saint. Because of the absence of master swordsmen, the Lady Curatus household has declined, clinging to former glories and being looked down upon by the other knightly houses. Annette stood by the window listening to the lady and inwardly marveled that Miss Rosarena was aiming to emulate the great ancestors. She did not hesitate to praise it as a noble and admirable resolve. However, the lady smiled and corrected her. The one Rosarena truly admired was not her forebears, but Arnik Brustrom, the sword saint who wielded the Ba Vuong Ki letter 1 EBFM. Annette's eyes widened in shock when she heard her name spoken so solemnly. She silently cried out, "So it's me!" as she realized the opponent who knocked her out was her own hardcore fan from a past life. Cut to Miss Rosarena's room. She lay face down on the bed, sulking and irritated, punching and kicking the pillow and shouting in anger for being scolded by her father merely for knocking Annette unconscious. This stubborn young lady could not understand why her father was so furious over such a trivial matter. After venting her anger, Rosarena sat up and grabbed the book on her bedside titled Legends of Arnuk Brustrom and the Ba Vuong Ki letter 1 EBFM, eagerly reading the passages describing the sword saint's divine power. Where each swing could topple mountains, cleave seas, and leave the world itself cleaved. The young lady's eyes shone with longing as she immersed herself in that heroic world. Rosarena hugged the book to her chest, face flushed with excitement. She quietly admired Brustrom's journey from slum dweller to the greatest sword saint in history despite prejudice. Rosarena vowed to herself that one day she would become as great as Sir Arnik Brustrom. Just then, a knock, dong dong, at the door interrupted her thoughts. Annette entered with a tray of tea and a polite greeting. "Sorry to disturb, I brought tea." And Rosarena coldly told her to leave it and turned away. But as Annette set the tray down and was about to withdraw, the young lady suddenly called, "Hey!" making Annette start and look back curiously. Rosarena looked Annette straight in the eye and repeated her earlier challenge. Since Annette lost, from now on she must become her retainer, Gia Lai. Annette asked blankly what a retainer must do, since she was already a servant of the household. Rosarena hesitated a little, then crossed her arms arrogantly and declared that Annette was the one chosen to accompany her on the path to becoming a sword saint. Miss Rosarena looked Annette in the eye and firmly demanded that she cooperate to help her become a true sword saint. Annette was stunned for a moment by this abrupt proposal and asked to pose one final question before deciding. She wanted to know the real reason behind the young lady's burning desire. Annette looked into Rosarena's wavering eyes and softly asked why the young lady was so determined to become a sword saint. Rosarena immediately brushed aside her hesitation and shouted that it was to restore her prestigious family. The girl's face filled with resolve and stubbornness as she declared the grand goal of her life. Rosarena began to pour out the humiliation of watching her family be treated as an outdated house clinging to past glory. She choked as she recounted how the current head of the Francia house had insulted her parents right in the National Hospital while she was receiving treatment. Because of that, Rosarena swore she must become a sword saint to make those people regret it and force them to see the Curatus family differently. Facing Annette, Rosarena proudly announced her full name, Rosarena West Lady Curatus, and stated her ultimate goal: to surpass the legend Arnuk Brustrom and become the strongest sword saint. Annette looked into the girl's eyes blazing with determination and began to sense the seriousness and weight behind the words of someone who had once admired her. Just as the atmosphere grew solemn, Annette suddenly changed her tone and sneered that if the young lady wanted to surpass Brustrom, she shouldn't be lying in bed reading like this. She even revealed the fact that at Rosarena's current age Brustrom could already slay dragons, which drained the color from Rosarena's face as she realized the vast gap between ideal and reality. Annette didn't stop there and launched sharper words, asserting that the young lady's earlier remarks were merely excuses for weakness. She emphasized that in any harsh circumstance, a true sword saint is someone who constantly swings the blade, not someone who only reads about it in books. Annette's words carried a killing edge and an overwhelming force that left Rosarena rooted in shock. With a self-satisfied smile, Annette asked the young lady, who was surely clever if she understood the problem now, but a moment later Annette froze as she realized she'd spoken too harshly when she saw Rosarena standing silently with her head bowed and hair shadowing her face. The maid began to sweat and flailed to excuse herself, saying she only wanted to remind the young lady that time would be insufficient if she wished to achieve that goal. But all efforts to soothe were too late when Rosarena looked up, face blazing with anger, and shouted, calling Annette a sharp-tongued maid. The furious young lady hurled whatever she could grab at Annette and drove her out of the room. Annette clutched her head and ran down the corridor, the door slamming bang behind her, leaving her sitting on the floor with a late, remorseful expression. The next morning in the kitchen, Annette was chopping vegetables and sighing heavily with regret over her harsh words from the day before. She thought that if things continued like this, the frail young lady would surely exhaust herself to death. As she was lost in thought and being scolded by Maglet for her distraction, the master suddenly burst into the kitchen in a state of extreme panic. The master was out of breath and produced a note left by Miss Rosserena that read, "I am going to the capital to train in swordsmanship. Please do not look for me." Annette stared at the letter with wide eyes in shock and silently blamed herself, thinking it was all her fault for goading the young lady too far and driving her to run away to chase that reckless dream. Annette hurriedly bowed and apologized to the master for letting things take such a turn. She immediately declared she would go find and bring the young lady back, then dashed out of the mansion to the astonishment of the master and Maglet. In her heart, Annette prayed constantly for the young lady's safety and blamed herself for letting matters go so far. The scene shifted to the bustling capital district with rows of crowded houses and a stream of busy pedestrians. Miss Rosserena appeared, face set with determination yet tinged with worry, standing before a building bearing a large sign reading, Adventurers Guild, the place she chose to begin her journey to become a sword saint. Meanwhile in the capital, the master, Maglet, and Annette were also present, frantically searching everywhere for the missing girl. They grabbed the hands of passers-by asking if anyone had seen a purple-haired girl like Rosserena. But all they received were shaken heads, and advice that a noble young lady certainly would not be found in such rough, crowded places. Annette stood in the busy streets, terrified and helpless as she still couldn't find the young lady. She scanned alleys and nooks, silently wondering where Rosserena could have gone. Images of her overzealous taunts from the previous day replayed in her mind, making Annette even more tormented for being the cause of Rosserena's disappearance. Maglet choked up, blaming herself for not watching the young lady carefully, but the lady gently comforted them that it was no one's fault. Meanwhile, Annette paused and concentrated on thinking carefully about what Rosserena admired. She looked at the book about Sword Saint Brushstrom and the note left behind, then suddenly cried out as she realized the only place the young lady would head was the Adventurers Guild. Annette immediately sprinted off to everyone's astonishment. At the Adventurers Guild, Miss Rosserena stood before the large wooden door with trembling hands from nervous excitement. The girl took a deep breath to regain her confidence, then pushed the door hard and stepped into a wholly unfamiliar world full of dangers waiting behind it. The door swung wide, drawing the attention of the rough-looking adventurers drinking inside. Rosserena froze in the aisle as the noisy chatter suddenly fell silent, replaced by curious stares and murmured whispers from strangers who regarded her like an odd creature in the wrong place. Rosserena mustered her courage and stepped into the center of the room under the gaze of dozens of muscular, fierce men. A few exclaimed, "What is this?" in surprise to see a well-dressed child dare enter such a place. She kept a serious expression and walked straight to the reception desk, astonishing everyone present. The clerk at the reception leaned down, incredulous, and asked what business she had there. Rosserena fell silent for a moment to steady herself, then looked the man in the eye and declared boldly, "I want to become a sword saint," leaving the clerk gaping in disbelief and repeating the question as if to make sure he hadn't heard wrong. Unfazed, Rosserena stood in the Adventurers Guild and shouted again that she wanted to become a sword saint right away. The naive yet determined proclamation plunged the room into deadly silence, while the receptionist simply stood frozen, staring at the child with complete shock. After her bold declaration, the guild fell into a stunned hush of bewildered looks, but a second later derisive laughter began to rise from the rough adventurers, which quickly exploded into loud ha-ha-ha-s that echoed through the room as if they had just heard the world's funniest joke. Rosserena stood pale with embarrassment and anger as the crowd mocked her. She shouted, asking what was so funny, and immediately a burly adventurer stepped forward and sneered that she should look in a mirror to see her own appearance. He mocked that a noble miss like her had no place in this harsh environment. Those around began to surround Rosserena, criticizing everything from her frilly dress to her slight, thin frame. One rude man even grabbed her pale arm and scoffed that with hands that had never held anything heavier than a spoon, how could she possibly swing a sword, leaving the poor girl trembling with tears of humiliation. The adventurer pressed his advantage, jeering that she probably had never done hard work. Rosserena struggled and shouted for him to let go. angrily declaring she was a descendant of the noble Curatus family and ordering the lowly adventurers not to touch her, but her words only amused them further. Rosarena's pride became a fuse when the rough adventurer, angered by being called lowly, growled, asking what right a fallen noble had to look down on others. His hostile glare and murderous intent terrified Rosarena into tears. She fell into despair, trapped by the violent circle. The man continued to insult Rosarena by mocking the tale of the sword saint, saying reality and fairy tales were far apart. Those who became sword saints like Brushstrom at her age could already slay dragons, not stand here crying. His cutting words pierced Rosarena's heart like a blade, and she could only bow her head and sob as she realized her own weakness. At the peak of the tension, the guild's door was suddenly thrown open with a powerful bang, making everyone jump and turn around. Amid dust and light streaming from the doorway stood the silhouette of a maid, standing tall with her face shadowed, projecting an invisible pressure that made the adventurers break into a sweat. Annette appeared breathless from running the long distance to find the young lady. She stood in the entrance with her maid uniform disheveled and her face sweaty but eyes full of resolve, her presence like a savior that strangely hushed the guild's noisy atmosphere. Seeing Annette, Rosarena was both joyful and moved, sobbing her name, while Annette's expression shifted and she broke into a radiant, relieved smile at seeing the young lady safe. She ignored the surrounding adventurers and excitedly ran straight toward Rosarena with overwhelming delight. Annette stepped beside Rosarena and apologized for keeping her waiting. She gently asked if the young lady had been crying, a question the girl shyly denied. Then Annette turned to the rough adventurers with a cold, disdainful look, thinking to herself that these were the ones who dared bother her mistress. The adventurers continued to sneer at Annette's arrival, mocking that this fallen noble family didn't even have a knight and had to send a mere little maid. The burly man jeered with contempt, but Annette remained calm. She gently reassured Rosarena that everything would be fine and to prepare to return home. Annette gripped Rosarena's trembling hand like a vow of protection, then led the young lady to leave the adventurers' guild. However, the rude adventurer suddenly kicked out, tripping the path before them. This malicious act caused Miss Rosarena to stumble and tumble forward in shock. Rosarena crashed to the floor with a scream of awe, prompting Annette to cry out, "Miss!" As she hurried to catch her, the surrounding adventurers erupted in gleeful ha-ha-ha-s at the girl's mishap. The man responsible smiled a sinister, triumphant grin, unaware he just crossed the final line of a sword saint. Annette rose with a hardened expression, and a chilling, murderous aura began to emanate. She stared straight at the adventurer with a razor gaze and snarled, asking what the hell he was doing to a child. The sudden shift in her attitude and the pressure of her stare made the big man tremble and break out in sweat from shock. In a commanding tone, Annette reprimanded the adventurer that their duty was to protect people from monsters, not to use their strength to bully children for amusement. She called him trash adventurer for forgetting basic professional ethics. The scathing rebuke enraged him to the point his eyes flashed, and he put a hand on his sword hilt to strike. The man drew his sword with a fierce look and shouted at Annette not to get cocky. The small girl remained unflinching, only casting a disdainful glance, then snatched a wine bottle from the nearby table and smashed it with a decisive crash. She held the jagged neck of the broken bottle in her hand and assumed a combat stance, eyes cold as ice. Annette stood boldly before the armed adventurer, armed only with a shard of broken glass, creating an intensely dramatic scene that left onlookers breathless. The adventurer sneered, asking if a brat like her truly thought she could beat him. But all he got in response was a face half hidden in shadow and a challenging, "Huh!" from Annette. A terrifying surge of power suddenly erupted behind Annette, imagined as a colossal beast baring fangs and claws. This murderous aura enveloped the entire guild, making even Miss Rosarena behind her tremble in fear, as Annette raised the broken shard high and uttered the words, "That is," signaling an unforeseen strike. Annette stared at her opponent with eyes wide and lethal, declaring, "That line should be said by me." Her face no longer that of a slight maid, but of a battle-hardened warrior who had seen 1,000 fights, the broken shard in her hand reflecting a cold light ready to fell her enemy at any moment. The adventurer staggered back in shock, his face full of panic as he realized he was facing something utterly bizarre and terrifying. He told himself he was a warrior who had fought dragons, but the overwhelming fear this girl radiated was unlike anything he'd ever felt, and he trembled, wondering what kind of monster this kid could be to exude such dominant killing intent. The rough adventurer was completely overwhelmed by the terrible killing aura emanating from Annette. He trembled so badly he couldn't lift his sword and stammered excuses that he was only joking, and had no serious intent toward a child, while those around them could only stand in horrified silence at the terrifying change in the little maid. Seeing the enemy's will to fight utterly broken, Annette withdrew her killing intent and casually released her grip, letting the broken bottle fall and shatter on the floor with a crash. She smiled brightly as if nothing had happened, diffusing the suffocating tension in the Adventurers Guild while leaving everyone present bewildered. Annette turned to Miss Rosarena with a gentle look, took the girl's hand, and softly said that everything was all right, then led her out of the Adventurers Guild with her head held high in proud composure. Leaving the rough adventurers still standing stunned, shocked by the latent power of a little maid. Walking through the capital's glittering streets, Annette breathed a sigh of relief that she had safely gotten the young lady out. She looked at Rosarena and curiously asked how the girl knew where to find her. Rosarena replied softly that she knew Arnuk Brushtrom had once been a famed adventurer, so she guessed the maid would look for her there, making Annette chuckle awkwardly and explain that she simply liked reading martial books. Rosarena suddenly smiled in satisfaction and praised Annette as a truly reliable servant, admonishing her to keep striving from now on to support Rosarena on the path to becoming a sword saint. Annette couldn't help but laugh at the young lady's innocence and enthusiasm, replying loudly, "Yes, trust me." While walking, Annette noticed a flower shop by the road and thought to herself that she should buy a bouquet to apologize to the lady and Mrs. Maglet for causing this trouble. She eagerly suggested the young lady come in to choose flowers, believing the lady would be delighted to receive a gift from her daughter. Rosarena nodded in agreement with an excited expression. As Annette was admiring and asking which flowers the young lady liked best, Rosarena suddenly fell silent and didn't answer. The maid felt a bad omen and quickly turned back toward the rear, only to find a deserted street with no one in sight. Annette screamed, "Miss!" in panic, her heart pounding as she realized her mistress had vanished in an instant. From the darkness of a nearby alley, a mysterious hooded man appeared and suddenly clamped a hand over Miss Rosarena's mouth from behind. The girls struggled desperately in the stranger's grasp, while Annette frantically ran toward them in horror and fear. Annette shouted the young lady's name again, horror evident on her face as she witnessed the kidnapping before her eyes. She tried to rush to help, but was suddenly attacked from behind by another assailant, leaving her in danger as well. Both girls were subdued by strangers with extremely mysterious intent. Annette had her mouth covered and was dragged into the darkness, groaning in pain as she realized they were dealing with professional human traffickers right in the capital. In that moment, she caught sight of a scorpion tail tattoo on the kidnapper's neck, her eyes widening in stunned recognition and the haunting thought, "Could it be? That man is still alive." The scene shifts back 33 years to a small alley where two men face each other. A long-haired gentleman in a tailored vest holds a curved saber and says he's only out kidnapping children to sell for money, while the short-haired youth brandishing a sword wreathed in flames sneers that the other's trade is garbage, though his skill is rather impressive. The long-haired man named Benedict of the Thunder Strike Blades looked astonished when he realized the person opposite him was the famed Ba Vuong K I letter 1 BFM. He felt deeply honored to be praised by someone of Arnuk's stature, even if the words were laced with disdain, and a sinister expression crept over Benedict's face from beneath the shadow that hid his eyes, coupled with an excited smile. Benedict hefted his curved saber into a fighting stance and stared at Arnuk, then suddenly offered, almost out of nowhere, whether Arnuk would consider joining him as an ally. Faced with the trafficker's invitation, Arnuk fell silent with a cold glare and replied with a contemptuous, "Huh." Benedict grinned ear to ear and argued that even if Arnuk served this kingdom, in the end he'd only be treated like a disposable pawn, insisting that joining forces with him would bring far greater benefits. But Arnuk immediately lunged with his blazing sword and shouted that he would never team up with trash like him. Benedict realized the negotiation had utterly failed and braced himself for a fight to the death. Arnuk executed an immense sword swing, carving brilliant, intersecting arcs through the air toward his opponent. The speed and force of the strike tore the surrounding space, as if rent by the pressure of the flaming blade. Facing that storming blow, Benedict managed to raise 2 fingers in time to perform a special defensive technique, stopping Arnuk's slash inches from his face and sending sparks flying everywhere. The two fell into a fierce deadlock as the fiery sword and curved saber clashed, producing ear-piercing screeches. With a confident smile, Benedict taunted that Arnuk seemed to be underrating him, while Arnuk, gritting his teeth and exerting force, replied with a smug look that he was in no way underestimating his foe. Seizing a brief opening, Arnuk suddenly spun and delivered an extremely fast horizontal slash that caught Benedict off guard. forcing him to exclaim in shock as the blade traced a long streak of light, and the long-haired man fell back to keep his distance. Arnike clicked his tongue in regret that his opponent was so quick, having come close to finishing him. Benedict stood frozen as his expression shifted, and a wound began to show. A long cut appeared across Benedict's forehead down to his left eye, blood gushing and obscuring half his face. He touched the wound in shock as he realized he'd been struck. But then Benedict burst into a mad, grotesque, a ha-ha laughter, making the atmosphere unbearably eerie. Benedict lifted his bloodied face to Arnok and praised him lavishly, claiming it was impressive to have struck him using accelerated magic. The long-haired man produced a square pendant engraved with a strange symbol from his pocket and clutched it tightly. Arnok maintained his stance and coldly declared that the next slash would certainly be the blade that ended Benedict's life. Arnok lunged forward with his blazing sword in a powerful, direct thrust aimed at the man's chest, but at the moment of impact Benedict's form blurred like gray smoke. Arnok's blade passed through emptiness, leaving him stunned as his opponent mysteriously vanished before his eyes. Arnok stood aghast in the empty alley as Benedict dissolved into nothing like a wisp of white smoke. He gritted his teeth, wondering what had just happened, and realized the accessory at Benedict's throat was a magical device capable of instant teleportation. With Benedict's sinister image and the tattoo on his neck still haunting his thoughts, Arnok silently vowed to remember this debt. Benedict's voice echoed in the air like a curse, vowing he would return to avenge the scar on his beautiful face. Arnok looked up at the cloudy sky with a dark, remorseful expression, clenching the hilt of his blazing sword in anger and swearing for letting such a dangerous criminal escape right before his eyes. A painful memory surfaced of Arnok standing alone in the capital. He blamed himself that, at that moment, he had committed the greatest mistake of a sword saint by letting Benedict slip away. The scene abruptly returned to the dark present in a damp dungeon with water dripping tick-tick, and someone anxiously called out, "Annette." Annette jolted awake, her face slick with sweat and eyes wide with terror. She realized Miss Rosarena was beside her, crying with relief at her recovery, while Annette clutched her pounding head and groaned, suspecting she had been struck when abducted. Rosarena hurriedly asked about the maid's condition, as Annette tried to reassure her mistress that she was all right. Annette quickly scanned their surroundings and realized they were locked inside a sturdy iron cell with cold stone walls. She was stunned, wondering where they were, and recognizing she had fallen into a human trafficker's den when she woke up imprisoned. Annette approached the bars and tested their solidity with her hand, clicking her tongue at how thick the iron was, while Rosarena stood behind her looking anxious and bewildered. Annette's gaze swept to the dark corner of the cell and froze as she saw many other children imprisoned there, faces full of fear, fatigue, and despair, huddled together. Annette inwardly realized this was indeed a large-scale kidnapping. She looked at Miss Rosarena, who stood petrified by the horrific sight, and felt the gravity of the situation. Rosarena trembled and asked what would happen to them next, prompting Annette to immediately regain composure and flash a confident smile to soothe her mistress, assertively declaring that everything would be fine because she was there to protect her. At that moment, heavy footsteps, clomp clomp, sounded down the corridor signaling someone approaching. Annette quickly shoved Rosarena behind her and urged the girl to hide well. Behind the bars appeared a portly man of grotesque nobility known as Lord Darth Warren, accompanied by a hooded henchman. The henchman announced that the new shipment for this round had arrived. Darth Warren wore a lecherous, sinister smile as he peered into the cell, licking his lips with hunger and expressing excitement at the prospect of what goods might await him. The children in the cell, including Annette and Rosarena, stared at the man with hatred and fear, while the henchman reminded Darth Warren that the children all had magical stone collars on their necks to suppress their powers. The fat man scoffed confidently and declared he would never allow these kids any chance to resist or escape his control. Lord Darth Warren stepped close to the bars and stared intently at Annette with obvious interest, deeming her a rather cute item, praising the proud, stubborn look in the little maid's eyes as delightful. Annette silently endured the humiliation with cold, lethal eyes, while Miss Rosarena stood behind her so terrified she could only let out a desperate hic. Darth Warren chuckled pervertedly with oh-ho-ho at the girl's fear, exclaiming he'd found adorable children futilely trying to flee. The henchman flattered him, saying Lord Darth truly had a discerning eye. He then revealed the shocking news that the purple-haired child was the young lady of the prestigious Lady Curatis family, which made the fat man even more excited at capturing such a bargain. The henchman added that, for a fallen house like the Curatis family, one or two missing children wouldn't cause them much trouble. Rosarena stood rooted to the spot in horror at the dismissive words about her family. Darth Warren suddenly approached the bars with a disgusting grin and demanded the young lady come closer so he could admire her pretty face. Annette stood between Rosarena and him with a resolute, fearless gaze that irritated Darth Warren. He called Annette a troublesome brat and immediately slapped her hard, the blow sending her flying to the floor before Rosarena's wide, shocked eyes. Rosarena cried out, "Annette!" in pain as her friend was struck down, but Darth Warren did not stop. He crudely thrust his fat hand through the bars and clamped his grip around the young lady's chin. The man drank in Rosarena's tear-filled, blazing eyes and praised that she truly lived up to being a noble young lady. This beauty was on an entirely different level from ordinary children. The fat man even stuck out his tongue as if to lick Rosarena's face, making her scream in terror. Seeing her mistress humiliated, Annette, though in pain, forced herself up and launched a fierce kick to Darth Warren's leg, causing him to cry out, "Ah!" Annette gritted her teeth, spat that he was a scoundrel, and demanded he let the young lady go at once. Wounded by a child, Darth Warren flew into a rage and roared, asking Annette what the hell she thought she was doing, then repeatedly unleashed cruel kicks at the maid sprawled on the floor to vent his fury. Rosarena could only clutch her head, sob uncontrollably, and beg him to stop torturing her friend. Annette was beaten to the point of losing consciousness and thought to herself that the situation was truly dire, her small body unable to endure anymore. Meanwhile, Rosarena rushed over, hugged Annette, and shouted for the fat man not to touch the maid. After a bout of abuse, Darth Warren stopped, panting with a smug smile as he had reached a cruel decision. The fat man loudly declared he would buy both children to satisfy his perversions. The henchman quickly bowed and asked about the bidding price. Darth Warren did not hesitate to splash the money, announcing each child was worth 500 gold coins, and he would pay 1,000 gold coins in total for both. A colossal sum that left the henchman stunned and elated. The henchman profusely thanked Lord Darth for his generosity and silently mocked the children's misfortune, while Rosarena and the other children sank into shock with despair-darkened faces. The henchman pulled out 2 wooden tags with numbers and ordered Annette and Rosarena to wear them around their necks. He explained these were ownership tags to ensure no one dared touch Lord Darth's goods until he officially possessed them. Darth Warren turned his back and strode down the dungeon corridor, laughing triumphantly, "Ha ha ha," declaring with perverse relish that he loved trampling on stubborn children and eagerly anticipated the day he would torture them. He left Rosarena standing frozen in the dark cell, eyes hollow as she realized a bleak future awaited her. Rosarena sobbed in despair thinking of the uncertain future for them both, wondering what would happen next. She shook Annette's motionless body hard and kept calling her name in the hope her friend would wake. In the dank gloom of the dungeon, the poor young lady could only beg Annette to open her eyes and look at her one more time. Another memory surfaced in Annette's mind. An image of a short-haired boy sitting alone with his knees drawn up amid a battlefield strewn with corpses. The boy wondering where he was and realizing this was himself as a child. At that moment, a mysterious long-haired girl appeared among the piled bodies and called, "Hey, sister," leaving the young Arnok utterly stunned. The girl standing in the shadows began to wail and mutter words full of hatred about wanting to kill someone. Young Arnok was horrified and trembling, pleading with his sister not to say such frightening things. The boy tried to reach out as if to stop her, but then broke into helpless tears, unable to change that painful reality. Back in the present, Rosarena kept wailing and wondering why she was so weak, with no strength to protect others. Suddenly, Annette opened her eyes slightly and smiled gently at the young lady, sending Rosarena into a jubilant outburst at seeing her friend still alive. The little maid forced herself up with a bruised face, but her eyes had regained their sharpness. Annette apologetically told the young lady she was ashamed for failing to protect her and letting things get so bad. Rosarena sniffled and said Darth Warren planned to sell them both in a week. Hearing that name, Annette clenched her teeth in fury as she looked at the price tags dangling nearby, feeling the humiliation was utterly intolerable. A terrifying aura of killing intent began to radiate from Annette as she privately concluded that this world was truly rotten, where the strong always sought to exploit and trample the weak. She clenched the ribbon at her chest and vowed she loathed that rule, the image of Sword Saint Arnok gripping his blade appearing as affirmation that the reason she had borne a sword all this time was to eliminate scum like them. Annette rose slowly, her face shadowed, and strode toward the iron cell door to the astonishment of Rosarena and the other children. She looked at the young lady with an enigmatic smile and declared that both of them would definitely escape this place. Annette asserted firmly that lacking strength was never a legitimate reason for someone to choose to abandon their fight. With iron will and an explosion of inner strength, Annette launched an extremely powerful kick that rang with a kang, shaking the whole dungeon. She roared in fury that she would wipe clean this rotten world and the trash who ran it, leaving Rosarena and the children watching with faces full of hope and worship for the maid who bore the soul of a legend. The scene cut to a dark underground corridor lit by wavering oil lamps, where a hooded henchman stood guard before a sturdy wooden door. Inside the room sat Benedict, marked by a scorpion tail tattoo, smirking wickedly and asking his subordinate if the news he'd heard was true. The henchman eagerly reported that Lord Darth Warren had just signed the auction agreement and was already on his way back to his domain. Benedict sat behind a desk piled high with gleaming gold coins, sneering at the thought that the greedy noble Darth Warren was willing to spend up to 1,000 gold coins just to buy a curatus young lady and a little maid. Benedict silently mused that the most important thing in life was to know how to seek out such perverted nobles to profit from. The human trafficking boss began scooping the gold into sacks with ring-laden fingers, calculating that if he used a bait trick to drive the price up, the proceeds would multiply many times over. Benedict tightened the sack's mouth with a triumphant smile, thinking to himself that the most crucial moment of the plan was near. Benedict's expression suddenly shifted to one of hatred and murderous intent as he declared that once he possessed wealth, power, and advanced magical instruments, he would make the Baltstein family, the ones who had cast him aside, pay an extremely heavy price, the nearby subordinate trembling as he called, boss. Seeing his master's madness, Benedict turned to the man named Geralt and asked whether he truly wanted to witness the annihilation of the Baltstein family, one of the 4 great knight houses. Benedict stepped closer to Geralt, squeezed his chin with a threatening smile, and asked if he was beginning to feel fear. Geralt stammered denials, insisting he was not afraid, but merely worried. He feared that after the recent crackdown on the black market, the gang's manpower was severely depleted, making it difficult to confront head-on the Order of Holy Knights, the kingdom's elite force. Benedict's rage erupted as he hefted Geralt into the air with one hand and bellowed furiously, asking who Geralt thought he was. Benedict shouted that he had suppressed his hatred and prepared for decades for this day, allowing no doubt or weakness to ruin his grand plan. With eyes glaring behind his round glasses, Benedict declared that if he could not utterly destroy that accursed Baltstein family, he would never be able to rest in peace. The terrifying pressure left Geralt gasping and quickly apologizing to placate his captain. Benedict then released him, sending Geralt crashing to the floor with a thud, and signaled his men to disappear from sight. Benedict regained his composure and began displaying the magical rings on his hands, proudly claiming that with these forbidden items, he now possessed attributes from flame, frost, and wind afflictions to cleaving strike, confidently asserting that no one in the kingdom could rival him. He even sneered, thinking that even sword Saint Arnuk Brushtrom, the only one who had foiled his plans in the past, no longer existed in this world. Benedict, excited, ordered Geralt to immediately begin the next step of the plan. Geralt trembled and replied, "Yes, sir." But at that moment the door was flung open with deafening bang, bang sounds. Another soldier rushed in breathlessly without bothering to knock, infuriating Benedict with the rude commotion. The soldier, panting, announced earth-shattering news. All the children held captive had completely vanished from the cells. Hearing this, Benedict froze for several seconds, his face draining of color. He stammered in utter astonishment, asking how and by what means those brats could have escaped such a secure prison. The time was marked as 1 hour earlier when the escape began. In the silent, dark corridor, Annette was pouring all her strength into repeated kicks. Thud, thud. Into the iron bars of the cell door. Rosarena, standing beside her, watched with a worried expression and cried Annette's name as she saw the maid risking herself like that. Annette panted, sweat streaming down, but her eyes blazed with determination. She told herself she could keep fighting even though her body was growing weary. Seeing this, Rosarena rushed to embrace Annette and shouted for her to stop, fearing that if she continued her legs would break. The other children also began to plead, thinking the action too dangerous and pointless. A few of the other children voiced pessimism, insisting that with children's strength they could never break this sturdy iron door. Annette fell silent for a moment on hearing that, then spoke in a low, sorrowful tone that precisely because they were children they had to struggle. The image of sword Saint Arnuk returned in her mind as a reminder of the pain of watching the weak be trampled. Annette took a deep breath and turned to look at the children with a pressuring gaze. Annette declared loudly that if they did not act right now, they would forever remain the playthings of that perverted old man. She scolded the children not to speak of giving up without truly trying, then turned back to the bars and ordered everyone to stand silent and watch, while Rosarena began to sense the seriousness and killing intent spreading from the maid. Unexpectedly, Rosarena stopped resisting and stepped forward with Annette to deliver the kick. Both little girls put their weight into their legs and launched simultaneous strikes. Thud, thud, against the bars. A triumphant smile appeared on Rosarena's face as she realized the power of unity. Annette looked at the young lady with surprise and pride, while the bars began to wobble under their combined impact. Witnessing the girls' courage, 2 older boys in the cells suddenly felt ashamed and decided they could not stand by any longer. They shouted and surged forward to assist, creating a scene full of hope as the 4 children together poured their life force into the prison-breaking kicks. The chubby boy and the short-haired boy both declared they would help as well, not wanting to be sold. Annette regarded these kids with a knowing smile and silently praised their spirit. The 2 remaining girls wiped away their tears and bravely stepped forward to join the collective escape. The group of children lined up shoulder to shoulder and executed powerful synchronized kicks against the iron door. The thud, thud, echoes rang through the dark corridor as the iron lock began to deform and crack. Meanwhile, down the corridor, the guard who had been dozing in his chair suddenly jolted awake at the strange sounds emanating from the cells. The guard groggily opened his eyes and cursed under his breath for being woken from his stupor. He looked toward the corridor with a sleepy expression, while the children inside the cell prepared for the final strike. Annette loudly called the cadence, 1, 2, 3, so everyone could coordinate rhythmically, concentrating maximal force on the door's weak point. An earth-shattering bang rang out as the iron cell door was completely blown off and hurled away by the tremendous force. The guard sprang up in panic, his face distorted with shock and fear. He shouted, asking what was happening and where that monstrous sound had come from, unable to believe that a group of children could have accomplished such a miracle. Back at the breakout, Annette and the chubby boy's efforts to kick the bars initially seemed hopeless as the cell door held firm. Annette panted in exhaustion while the other children began to lose heart, and just then the guard rushed over in alarm asking what was going on. Annette sprang a plan and signaled silently. Now! The maid suddenly collapsed to the floor, clutching her leg in apparent agony, her pained expression making the guard gape in astonishment. Annette began to perform a convincing act of pain, holding her leg and crying out, "It hurts! It hurts!" Her screams completely fooling the guard into believing she had been severely injured during the attempt to break the door. Young Lady Rosarena cooperated, rushing to Annette's side and calling her name with a terrified look, creating a chaotic scene that played on the guard's compassion and worry. Seeing that the valuable item, worth 500 gold coins belonging to Lord Darth Warren might have a broken bone, the guard panicked, thinking he would be in big trouble if he didn't act quickly. He hurriedly drew his keys to open the cell, intending to go in and treat Annette immediately, while Annette lay motionless on the floor watching his every move through her fingers. As soon as the guard opened the door and stepped in, Annette sprang up with a malicious grin and delivered a powerful headbutt to his stomach, catching him completely off guard. The maid moved like lightning, grabbing his collar and forcing his head down onto the floor. The guard could only utter pained sounds of ah, as he realized he had been trapped by a child. Annette fully subdued the guard with professional technique, leaving him flat and immobile on the floor. Young Lady Rosarena looked at her friend with admiration, silently remarking that Annette's methods were brutal but effective. The maid picked up the bunch of keys that had fallen on the floor and held them up with a radiant smile, telling the young lady and the children that they could now officially get out. After escaping the cells, the group of children ran down dark stone corridors for an hour searching for an exit, Annette leading them with steadfast resolve, while Rosarena carried a stick for self-defense. However, the painful truth was revealed. Only 4 other children had the courage to follow the 2 girls. Many others had had their will to escape completely stripped away and chose to remain in the darkness of despair. With an unwavering spirit, Annette led Rosarena and the short-haired boy as they dashed through the gloomy dungeons. The maid loudly shouted the rallying cry, "Just run straight ahead!" To boost morale, and the image of the group fleeing with fierce faith created a heroic moment inside the trafficker's den. While running, the group suddenly froze when they heard footsteps. Clop, clop. Ahead, from the darkness around the bend, a tall shadow emerged, causing Annette, Rosarena, and the short-haired boy to gape in surprise. Benedict appeared with a wicked smile and sneered that the little rats had indeed tried to escape. The trafficking boss looked at the children with a dangerous gaze, as if preparing to deliver punishment. Benedict extended his hand bedecked with magical rings and arrogantly announced his true name, Benedict Baltstein. his sudden appearance as the group's most formidable enemy turning Rosarena and the children pale with fear. Annette stood in front to protect them, sweating as she faced the ghost of her past head-on. Moments before encountering the enemy, the children had brief moments to get to know one another. The short-haired boy introduced himself as Grace, the chubby boy as Jeek, and the two girls as Anna and Milna. Annette smiled and gave her name, introducing Rosarena as her mistress. They promised to get through the ordeal together, but now they all faced a life-or-death challenge named Benedict. While moving, young Lady Rosarena suddenly brandished the broom she was carrying and declared loudly that if anything happened she would use it to fight. Annette asked in bewilderment where she got the broom, and Rosarena replied innocently that she had picked it up from the guard earlier, thinking it could serve as a weapon. Seeing the young lady's confident face as she held the broom, Annette could only force a smile and think to herself that even in her previous life as the Sword Saint, she had never gone into battle wielding a broom. The short-haired boy named Grace stepped forward and urged Annette and Rosarena to join forces with them to get out of there. Annette, seeing the children's unity, gave a slight smile of agreement because she realized she had no choice now but to carry this lot as well. The image of the whole group fleeing together with fierce determination created an atmosphere full of hope within the dark dungeon. The children began to move cautiously. Sorrow, the corridors to avoid detection by the guards watching in the distance. Annette led and signaled everyone to hide in the shadows whenever a light swept by. She silently calculated that if they advanced carefully, their chances of escape were high. Yet she remained deeply worried about the magical collars they all had to wear. Annette stared at the collar on her neck and realized it was a magical device designed to prevent slaves from running away. She suspected that if they went too far without removing it, some locating or attacking spell would surely trigger. To break that curse, they would likely have to fight the ringleader. The aching pain in her legs, Zuki. After the breakout made Annette grit her teeth and curse as she recognized how dire the situation had become. Memories of Sword Saint Arnik returned. He standing alone facing massive, ferocious giants without faltering. Annette told herself that in her past life she was someone who charged straight at the enemy, no matter how unfavorable the odds. She silently apologized for having told the young lady that lacking strength was an excuse. For now, she herself had to struggle not to voice complaints about their harsh circumstances. Annette bowed her head and exhaled. Ha ha! Feeling the weight of responsibility pressing on her small shoulders, she inwardly affirmed that with this new body, she would once again prove the instincts of a true warrior, her gaze hardening beneath her fringe as she decided to face every challenge ahead. Grace suddenly spoke up, reminding Annette that if danger came, she should trust and lean on them a bit. The boy sincerely thanked her for her courage, saying that if she had not stood up, they might all have remained slaves forever. Hearing the children's heartfelt encouragement warmed Annette. She broke into a radiant smile and thought to herself that these kids weren't so bad after all. Suddenly, Annette's legs buckled. Kick, as the pain flared, forcing her to clutch her knee with a pained face. Rosarena and the children rushed over in alarm to check on the maid, and although Annette tried to push herself up and insisted she could continue, she was inwardly very worried. She realized walking was manageable, but if they had to enter a real fight with these injured legs, the situation would become extremely dangerous.